I'm going to kill everyone in this building until someone gives me my sister. Those were the words that the security camera at St. Jude's Medical Center captured at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night, spoken by a man so large that the camera had to pan upward just to capture his face. The footage would eventually be viewed over 40 million times, shared across every social media platform, dissected by news anchors and armchair experts who had never faced anything more dangerous than a traffic ticket. But none of them understood what they were really watching. None of them saw what I saw when I first reviewed that grainy black and white recording. The footage begins with peace. The emergency room waiting area is quiet, populated by the usual Friday night collection of minor injuries and worried family members. A security guard sits at his desk doing a crossword puzzle. Nurses move between stations with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this 1,000 times before. And then in the span of a single heartbeat, everything changes. A black SUV crashes through the metal bollards outside the ambulance bay, steam erupting from its destroyed radiator like the breath of some wounded beast. The driver's door doesn't open. It gets kicked completely off its hinges, and something steps out that doesn't quite look human. The man is enormous, easily 7 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they seem to block out the parking lot lights behind him. He stands in the pouring rain for just a moment, his head tilted back, and even without audio, you can feel the primal scream that tears from his throat. What happens next is chaos in its purest form. The giant charges the emergency room doors with a speed that seems impossible for someone his size. The tempered safety glass explodes inward like it was made of sugar. A 300-pound security guard, a man who played defensive line for the University of Washington, tries to intercept him and gets thrown across the room like a child's toy. Doctors freeze. Patients scream. And in the middle of all that terror, one person moves forward instead of back. She's tiny. 5'2", maybe 110 pounds, soaking wet. Her blonde hair is pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her scrubs hang loose on her frame like she borrowed them from someone twice her size. She looks like a librarian who wandered into the wrong building, like a strong gust of wind could knock her over. The timestamp on the footage reads 11:47:23 when she steps directly into the path of the charging giant. Everyone who watched that video thought the same thing in that moment. They thought they were about to witness a murder. They thought the tiny nurse was going to be torn apart by a monster she had no business confronting. They were wrong. They were so incredibly beautifully wrong. Within 6 minutes, the 7-foot giant would be unconscious on the floor, smoke rising from electrical burns on his hands and face. The tiny nurse would be slumped against a wall, bleeding from a dozen cuts, her body broken, but her patients alive. The nickname would spread across the internet within hours, a title she never asked for and never wanted. They called her the Titan Slayer. But the footage doesn't tell you who she really was. It doesn't explain why the smallest person in that emergency room was also its deadliest weapon. It doesn't reveal the 5 years of secrets she had buried, or the red dress she used to wear, or the reason her hands were steadier than any surgeons in the building. And it certainly doesn't tell you the truth about the giant, about why he was really there, about the sister he was trying to save, and the love that had twisted into something monstrous. This is the true story of what happened that night. The story the cameras couldn't capture and the news reports got wrong. The story of how a woman who had spent 5 years trying to disappear finally had to remember who she really was. The story of the night the predator became the prey. 7 minutes before the glass shattered, the emergency room at St. Jude's Medical Center existed in that peculiar state of tension that only healthcare workers truly understand. It wasn't quite calm because an emergency room is never truly calm, but it was balanced on a knife's edge between routine and catastrophe, and everyone who worked there could feel it in their bones. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with that particular frequency that seems to exist only in hospitals, a low electrical buzz that becomes so constant you stop hearing it consciously, but never stop feeling it in the back of your skull. The rain outside had been falling for 3 hours straight, one of those Pacific Northwest storms that turns the sky into a solid gray ceiling and makes the whole world feel like it's slowly drowning. Water streamed down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ambulance bay, distorting the parking lot lights into smeared yellow ghosts. It was 10:40 p.m. on a Friday, what the night shift staff called the witching hour, with a mixture of dark humor and genuine dread. This was the precise moment when the happy hour drunks had metabolized enough alcohol to start making truly catastrophic decisions, when the domestic disputes that had been simmering all week finally boiled over into violence when the overdose calls started rolling in from apartments and alleys across the city. The waiting room was about half full, with the usual collection of misery. A teenage boy cradling what was obviously a broken wrist, an elderly woman with a persistent cough that had worried her enough to brave the storm, a young couple whispering urgently to each other about something they clearly didn't want anyone else to hear. The smell of the place was something you never got used to, no matter how many years you worked there. Antiseptic cleaner layered over floor wax, layered over the sharp copper undertone of blood that no amount of mopping could ever fully eliminate. Recycled air pumped through overhead vents carried the ghost of every patient who had ever passed through these doors, the sick and the dying, and the merely frightened, all of them, leaving some invisible trace of themselves in the atmosphere. Underneath it all was the ever-present aroma of cafeteria coffee, burned and bitter, the lifeblood of every nurse and doctor who had ever pulled a graveyard shift. The emergency room itself was laid out in a careful geometry designed by people who understood that every second mattered when someone was dying. The main waiting area fed into a triage desk where patients were sorted by the severity of their conditions, and beyond that stretched the treatment area with its numbered bays, separated by curtains that provided the illusion of privacy without actually offering any. Trauma bays 1 through 4 lined the far wall, equipped with the kind of machinery that could restart a stopped heart or breathe for lungs that had given up. The long corridor to the ICU disappeared around a corner that always seemed darker than the rest of the building, no matter how many light bulbs maintenance replaced. The security checkpoint sat near the main entrance, a desk that was supposed to make people feel safe, but mostly served as a speed bump for anyone determined to cause trouble. Tonight it was manned by Danny Sullivan, a man so large that the desk looked like it belonged in a kindergarten classroom when he sat behind it. Danny had played football at the University of Washington 15 years ago, and even though those days were long behind him, he still carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation in his entire life. He was doing a crossword puzzle, occasionally glancing up at the security monitors with the bored expression of a man who had seen it all and wasn't particularly impressed by any of it. Something felt wrong tonight. The staff couldn't articulate. It couldn't point to any specific thing and say, "This is what's different." But the feeling was there nonetheless. It was in the way the air pressure seemed slightly off, making ears pop for no apparent reason. It was in the unusual quiet of the waiting room, where even the sick children weren't crying as much as they usually did. It was in the storm outside, which seemed to be building towards something instead of simply passing through. The clock on the wall read 10:41 p.m. In 6 minutes, the world would change. Lily Harper sat at the nurse's station with her shoulders hunched forward and her eyes fixed on a computer screen that she wasn't really seeing. Her scrubs were a faded blue that had been washed so many times the fabric was starting to pill at the seams, and they hung on her small frame like she had borrowed them from someone 2 sizes larger. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that was already starting to come loose. Stray strands framing a face that most people would describe as forgettable, if they bothered to describe it at all. She was 28 years old, stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighed approximately 108 pounds after a heavy meal. Everything about her physical presence seemed designed to take up as little space as possible in the world. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She walked with her head down and her shoulders curved inward, and she had a habit of flinching slightly whenever anyone addressed her directly. The badge clipped to her scrub top identified her as a traveler, the hospital's term for temporary nursing staff brought in to fill gaps in the schedule, and the red letters of that designation seemed to mark her as someone who wasn't quite real, wasn't quite permanent, wasn't quite worth getting to know. The other nurses had already formed their opinions about Lily Harper in the 3 weeks she had been working at St. Jude's, and none of those opinions were particularly flattering. She was weird, they said, during shift changes and lunch breaks. Like a robot always watching everything but never actually engaging with anyone. One of the younger nurses had tried to make conversation with her in the break room, asking what she did on her days off, and Lily had answered with a single word that had become a running joke among the staff. Maintenance. Who spends their free time doing maintenance? What does that even mean? Dr. Nathan Cole had been particularly vocal in his assessment of the new traveler nurse. Cole was the kind of surgeon who appeared on magazine covers and gave TED Talks about the future of medicine, blessed with the jawline of a movie star and an ego that matched his considerable talent. He had just finished a 6-hour vascular repair on a gunshot victim from downtown, and he was riding the high of a successful surgery combined with enough caffeine to drop a horse. Earlier that evening, Lily had overheard him holding court with a group of residents near the coffee machine. his voice carrying across the treatment area with the confidence of someone who had never considered that his words might have consequences. "Have you seen the new traveler?" Cole had asked, gesturing vaguely in Lily's direction, without bothering to check if she was within earshot. "Looks like a high school volunteer playing dress-up. If a code gray comes in, what's she gonna do? Politely ask the meth head to take a seat? Give her 2 weeks tops. She'll wash out like all the others." The residents had laughed because that's what residents did when attending physicians made jokes, and Lily had continued charting her patient's vitals as if she hadn't heard a thing. But she had heard. She heard everything. That was one of the many things about Lily Harper that nobody at St. Jude's understood, one of the countless details that didn't fit the narrative they had constructed around the quiet, mousy nurse who seemed afraid of her own shadow. Because there were things about Lily Harper that her co-workers couldn't see, things hidden beneath the oversized scrubs and the downcast eyes and the whisper-soft voice. Things like the scar tissue that ran in a jagged line from her right collarbone down to her shoulder blade, hidden beneath the fabric where no one would think to look. Things like the way she never made a sound when she walked, her footsteps somehow silent, on floors that squeaked under everyone else's shoes. Things like the way she always knew exactly where the exits were in any room she entered, how her eyes would track them automatically, without her even being consciously aware of the habit. If anyone had been paying close attention, really paying attention in the way that Lily herself paid attention to everything around her, they might have noticed something else strange. When a metal tray crashed to the floor in the cafeteria 3 stories below, the sound echoing up through the building's ventilation system, every nurse at the station jumped. Every nurse except Lily. She didn't flinch. Instead, her weight shifted almost imperceptibly to the balls of her feet. Her shoulders dropped into a slight crouch, and her eyes swept toward the nearest exit before anyone else had even registered what the sound was. In her pocket, her fingers found the worn metal surface of a challenge coin that she carried everywhere she went. The insignia on its face had been rubbed almost smooth by years of nervous touching, but if you held it up to the light at just the right angle, you could still make out the shape of a medical cross superimposed over a pair of crossed rifles. It was a memento from another life, from a woman who had a different name and a different purpose, and a very different way of moving through the world. 5 years ago, Lily Harper didn't exist. 5 years ago, there was only Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, combat medic, attached to units whose designations were still classified and sent to places that didn't appear on any map. 5 years ago, there was a woman who could walk into any room and command it without saying a word. A woman who wore form-fitting red dresses to military galas and danced with men who would die for her without hesitation. A woman whose hands had saved dozens of lives and taken more than she cared to remember. That woman was gone now, buried under layers of anonymity and carefully cultivated weakness hidden behind a badge that said, Traveler, because travelers didn't put down roots, didn't form attachments, didn't stay in one place long enough for anyone to start asking questions. Lily Harper was a ghost wearing the skin of an ordinary person, and she had spent 5 years perfecting the disguise. But tonight, her hand kept drifting to that challenge coin. Tonight, the old instincts were firing in ways they hadn't fired since she left the service. Tonight, something in the air tasted like copper and cordite, like blood and battle, like the moments before everything went wrong. The clock on the wall read 10:43 p.m. Lily Harper looked up at the security monitors above the nurses' station and felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up for no reason she could articulate. She whispered something to herself that no one else heard, something that had been drilled into her by instructors whose faces she could no longer remember. When the enemy is larger, be faster. When faster isn't enough, be smarter. When smarter isn't enough. She let the rest of the sentence trail off because she didn't want to think about what came after. Not yet. Doctor. Nathan Cole stood in the center of Trauma Bay 2, like a general surveying a battlefield, barking orders at the nurses and residents who scurried around him with the desperate efficiency of people who knew that any mistake would be met with withering contempt. He had been awake for nearly 18 hours at this point, running on a combination of surgical adrenaline and the kind of industrial-strength coffee that the hospital vending machines dispensed for 75 cents a cup, and his mood had shifted from merely arrogant to actively dangerous. Get me another unit of O negative, and someone tell the lab that if they take more than 5 minutes, I'm going to walk down there personally and have a conversation they won't enjoy. Cole snapped at a resident whose name he had never bothered to learn. And where is my suture kit? I asked for a suture kit 30 seconds ago. Does nobody in this building understand the concept of urgency? The patient on the table was a 43-year-old man who had been shot twice during what the police were calling a road rage incident, though the precise circumstances were still unclear. Cole had spent 6 hours repairing the damage to his inferior vena cava and reconstructing a portion of his liver, and the surgery had been successful by any objective measure. The man would live. The man would walk out of this hospital in a few weeks and return to whatever life had brought him to the point of getting shot in a parking lot on a Friday night. But Cole wasn't satisfied with success. Cole was never satisfied. He had built his entire career on the foundation of being the best, the brightest, the most indispensable surgeon in any room he entered, and that foundation required constant reinforcement. Every successful surgery was proof of his genius. Every complication was someone else's fault. The ecosystem of blame and credit that surrounded him was as carefully maintained as the sterile environment of his operating room. Patricia Morrison watched Cole's performance from the triage desk with an expression that managed to be both exhausted and contemptuous, a combination she had perfected over 25 years of working in this emergency room. Patty, as everyone called her, was 52 years old and built like a longshoreman with forearms that came from a lifetime of physical labor and a face that had seen too much to be shocked by anything anymore. She had survived the crack epidemic of the 80s, the gang wars of the 90s, 3 hospital mergers, 2 changes in ownership, and countless doctors who thought their medical degrees made them gods. Cole was not impressive to Patty Morrison. Cole was a problem. She had to manage a source of conflict. She had to smooth over a personality disorder wrapped in surgical scrubs and a superiority complex. She had seen a dozen Nathan Coles come through this hospital over the years. Brilliant men who confused their technical skills with wisdom and their confidence with competence. Most of them eventually learned humility, usually through some catastrophic failure that their egos couldn't explain away. The ones who didn't learn either quit or got fired. Either way, Patty would outlast them all. What did interest Patty Morrison in a way that she couldn't quite articulate even to herself was the new traveler nurse who had been working the night shift for the past 3 weeks. There was something wrong about Lily Harper, something that didn't add up no matter how many times Patty tried to do the math. The girl was quiet and timid and seemed to jump at her own shadow, which was exactly the kind of nurse who washed out within the first month at a level 1 trauma center. But she also moved wrong, walked wrong, stood wrong in ways that Patty had only ever seen in one other type of person. Her grandson had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home with a head full of nightmares and a body that never quite relaxed. He moved the same way Lily Harper moved, always aware of the exits, always scanning for threats, always carrying himself like violence might erupt at any moment, and he needed to be ready for it. Patty had never asked Lily about her past, because that wasn't the kind of question you asked a traveler who clearly didn't want to be known, but she had filed the observation away in the mental cabinet, where she kept all the things that might become important later. The ambulance bay doors burst open with a pneumatic hiss, admitting a gust of cold rain-scented air, and 2 paramedics pushing a gurney at a near sprint. Overdose female mid-20s. The lead paramedic shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos of the treatment area. Found unresponsive at a residence approximately 40 minutes ago. Pupils fixed and dilated, BP crashing, respiratory rate at 6. We pushed Narcan on scene with minimal response. The emergency room snapped into action with the practiced precision of a machine that had performed this exact sequence thousands of times before. Dr. Cole abandoned his post-surgical posturing and strode toward the incoming gurney, already calling out orders for IV access and arterial blood gas analysis. Nurses materialized from various corners of the treatment area, each one falling into their assigned role without needing to be told. Even Lily Harper moved toward the commotion, though she positioned herself at the periphery, where she could observe without getting in the way. The woman on the gurney was young, maybe 24 or 25, with dark hair that was matted with sweat and pale skin that had taken on the grayish tinge of oxygen deprivation. Her eyes were open, but unseeing, and her breath came in shallow gasps that seemed to take more effort than her failing body could afford. She was wearing a thin sundress that was completely inappropriate for the weather, and her arms bore the telltale track marks of someone who had been fighting a losing battle with addiction for a long time. Lily noticed something that nobody else was paying attention to. In the chaos of the transfer from gurney to treatment table, the patient's personal belongings had been tossed into a plastic bag and left on a chair beside the bed. A purse battered and worn with the strap broken. Lily picked it up without thinking, an automatic response from her training that said all information about a patient could be relevant. Inside the purse was a wallet with no cash, a phone with a cracked screen, and a photograph. The photograph showed two people. One was the woman on the table, her face healthy and smiling in a way that bore no resemblance to the gray mask she wore now. The other was a man. An enormous man, easily 7 feet tall, with shaved head and gentle eyes, and arms wrapped protectively around the woman, like he could shield her from everything wrong in the world. On his neck, clearly visible in the photograph, was a tattoo of a single word in elegant script: Grace. Lily looked at the woman on the table, then at the photograph, then at the chart that one of the nurses had started filling out. Patient name, Grace Brennan. Emergency contact, Dominic Brennan. Relationship listed as brother. Something cold settled in Lily's stomach, the kind of premonition that had saved her life more times than she could count in places far more dangerous than this hospital. She looked at the photograph again, at the massive man with the protective embrace and the gentle eyes, and she heard a voice in the back of her head that sounded like the instructor who had trained her a lifetime ago. That man would die for her. That man would kill for her. And right now, someone needs to find out where that man is. The clock on the wall read 10:45 p.m. Lily felt it before she could name it, a subtle wrongness in the air that made her body react before her conscious mind had a chance to process what was happening. Her spine straightened almost imperceptibly, her weight shifting to the balls of her feet in a movement so automatic that she wasn't even aware she had done it. The challenge coin in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, like it was trying to remind her of something she had spent 5 years trying to forget. The sensation was difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't been trained to recognize it. It wasn't exactly a sound, though there was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel through the floor tiles and up through the soles of her sensible nursing shoes. It wasn't exactly a change in the air pressure, though her ears had popped slightly, and there was a thickness to the atmosphere that hadn't been there a moment ago. It was more like the feeling you get right before a thunderstorm breaks, that electric anticipation that makes the hair on your arm stand up and your heart beat a little faster for no reason you can articulate. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, twice, 3 times, casting the treatment area into a strobe-like pattern of light and shadow that made everyone look like they were moving in stop motion. Someone muttered something about the storm interfering with the power grid, and one of the maintenance staff made a note to check the emergency generators. Normal explanations for an abnormal feeling. Reasonable responses to an unreasonable atmosphere. Lily wasn't looking at the lights. She was looking at the security monitors mounted above the nurses' station, the same monitors she had glanced at 100 times over the past 3 weeks without really seeing them. Tonight, she was seeing them. Tonight, her eyes were tracking movement in the parking lot that she couldn't quite make out through the rain-distorted camera feed. Tonight, every instinct she had spent 5 years burying was screaming at her to pay attention, to prepare to remember who she used to be and what she was capable of doing. Danny Sullivan looked up from his crossword puzzle at the security desk, his pen frozen in midair as something outside caught his attention. Lily watched his face change through the monitor's reflection, watched the bored complacency drain away and be replaced by confusion, then concern, then something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Danny Sullivan was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 280 pounds, a former football player who had spent his entire adult life being the biggest and strongest person in any room he entered. Lily had never seen him look afraid of anything. Unit 1 to dispatch Danny, said into his radio, his voice carrying across the waiting room with a tremor that the security guard probably didn't even realize was there. I don't know what I've got. There's a vehicle moving fast in the ambulance lane. It's not an ambulance. Lily was already moving, drifting away from the treatment area where Dr. Cole was still working on Grace Brennan, positioning herself where she could see both the security monitors and the actual ambulance bay doors at the same time. Her body was doing things her mind hadn't authorized, reverting to patterns of behavior that had been drilled into her so deeply they had become part of her operating system. Assess the threat, identify exits, calculate distances, prepare for contact. On the security monitor, a black SUV appeared at the edge of the frame, traveling at a speed that was completely inappropriate for a hospital parking lot. It wasn't slowing down. It wasn't following the marked lanes or the posted signs. It was aimed directly at the metal bollards that separated the ambulance bay from the general parking area, and it was accelerating. The impact was audible, even through the reinforced glass of the emergency room doors, a crunch of metal and concrete that made several people in the waiting room jump out of their seats. Steam erupted from the SUV's destroyed radiator, billowing up into the rain-filled air like the breath of some massive wounded animal. The driver's side doors didn't open in any normal sense of the word. It was kicked completely off its hinges with a force that sent it spinning across the wet pavement like a discarded toy. And then he stepped out. Even on the small grainy security monitor, Lily could see that this was not an ordinary man. He was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they seemed to span the entire frame of the destroyed vehicle's door. He wore a torn gray hoodie that strained against muscles that looked like they had been built in a factory rather than a gym. And even through the rain, she could see that his skin was flushed and angry red veins bulging from his neck like thick cables under pressure. He stood in the downpour for a moment, his massive head tilted back toward the sky, and though the camera had no audio, Lily could see the scream that tore from his throat. It was a scream of rage and grief, and something else that she recognized from her years in places where people went to die. It was the scream of a man who had already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear. Lily's hand found the challenge coin in her pocket, her thumb tracing the worn insignia as she whispered words she hadn't spoken in 5 years. When the enemy is larger, be faster. When faster isn't enough, be smarter. When smarter isn't enough, the giant began to move toward the emergency room doors. Be ruthless. The man who stepped out of that wrecked SUV was named Dominic Brennan, though Lily wouldn't learn that name for several more minutes. What she learned immediately, what everyone in that emergency room learned in the span of a few terrifying seconds, was that conventional rules did not apply to whatever was coming toward them through the rain. He moved with a speed that seemed physically impossible for someone his size, covering the 20 yards from the SUV to the emergency room doors, in what felt like the time it takes to draw a single breath. His feet didn't seem to touch the puddles that had formed on the pavement, or if they did, they displaced so much water that it looked like small explosions trailing in his wake. His arms pumped at his sides with the mechanical efficiency of a machine designed for a single purpose, and that purpose was clearly not peaceful. The emergency room's automatic doors were designed to open quickly to accommodate the rapid movement of gurneys and the urgency of medical professionals responding to crises. They were not designed to accommodate the rapid movement of a 7-foot giant who had no intention of waiting for anything to open. The tempered safety glass, engineered to shatter into harmless pebbles rather than dangerous shards, exploded inward under the impact of his shoulder with a sound like 1,000 champagne glasses hitting the floor simultaneously. Diamond-bright fragments of glass rained down onto the linoleum, scattering across the floor in a glittering carpet that crunched under his heavy boots as he crossed the threshold. In person, he was even more terrifying than he had appeared on the grainy security footage. His head nearly brushed the 8-foot ceiling of the emergency room entryway, forcing him to duck slightly as he moved forward. The gray hoodie he wore was torn in several places, revealing glimpses of the musculature beneath muscles that seemed to have been built layer upon layer like the rings of an ancient tree. His hands were the size of dinner plates, his fingers thick as sausages, and they were clenched into fists so tight that the knuckles had turned white. But it was his face that told the true story, that revealed the humanity buried beneath the monster that everyone else could see. His eyes were black, the pupils dilated so fully that they had consumed the iris entirely, giving him the appearance of something demonic, something inhuman. Foam had gathered at the corners of his mouth, flecks of white against lips that were pulled back in a permanent snarl. His skin was flushed that angry red that Lily recognized from her medical training as a sign of extreme cardiovascular stress, and the veins in his neck pulsed visibly with each thunderous beat of his heart. This was excited delirium syndrome, a state of extreme agitation that occurred when the body's chemical systems went catastrophically wrong. Adrenaline flooded the bloodstream in quantities that normal human physiology was never designed to handle, granting strength and speed that bordered on the superhuman, while simultaneously destroying the body's ability to regulate pain temperature or rational thought. People in excited delirium had been known to shrug off taser strikes, to fight through pepper spray, to take multiple gunshot wounds and keep coming like they hadn't felt a thing. They were not monsters, but they were something very close to it. Yet, even through the chemical fog that had consumed his higher brain functions, something human remained visible in Dominic Brennan. Something desperate and terrified and heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who had ever loved someone enough to destroy themselves trying to save them. When he opened his mouth and screamed, the words that came out were not the random sounds of madness. They were a name. Grace, where is Grace? Lily felt her blood run cold. Grace, the woman on the table in Trauma Bay 2, the overdose patient they had been working to stabilize. The woman in the photograph smiling in the arms of a giant who looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a junkie having a psychotic break or a drunk looking for a fight. This was a brother trying to save his sister, and in his current state, he would tear through anyone and anything that stood between them. She watched him scan the emergency room with those terrible black eyes, watched him process the screaming patients and the frozen staff, and the layout of the space with a tactical awareness that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his condition. Military training, she realized with a start. The way he cleared the corners with his eyes, the way he positioned his body to minimize exposure, the way he moved with purpose rather than chaos. All of it spoke to years of combat training that had been burned so deeply into his muscle memory that even a complete breakdown of higher cognition couldn't erase it. On his neck, clearly visible now that he was inside, and the light was better, she could see the tattoo she had noticed in the photograph. Grace. Elegant script professionally done, placed where he would see it every time he looked in a mirror. A permanent reminder of the person who mattered most. A brand that proclaimed his identity to anyone who cared to look. And underneath the torn collar of his hoodie glinting in the harsh fluorescent light, she could see something else. Dog tags. Military dog tags, the kind that soldiers wore in combat zones so their bodies could be identified if the worst happened. Oh God. Lily whispered a prayer and a realization at the same time. He's not the villain. He's the victim. But that didn't change what was about to happen. That didn't stop the giant from moving toward the trauma bay where his sister lay dying. That didn't prevent the violence that was inevitable when an unstoppable force encountered a room full of vulnerable people. He was going to hurt someone. He was going to hurt a lot of people. And unless someone stopped him, he was going to destroy himself and everyone around him trying to save the only person he had left to lose. The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. Danny Sullivan had been the head of security at St. Jude's Medical Center for 7 years, and in that time, he had handled more violent situations than he cared to remember. He had tackled knife-wielding psychiatric patients, restrained drug addicts in the throes of withdrawal, broken up fistfights between gang members who had ended up in adjacent treatment bays. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 280 pounds, and he had never, not once in his entire life, encountered a situation that his size and strength couldn't handle. This was different. This was something else entirely. Danny stepped into the center of the hallway with his taser drawn, positioning himself between the giant and the rest of the emergency room in a stance he had practiced 1,000 times during training. His voice was steady when he spoke because he was a professional, and professionals didn't let fear affect their performance. But there was a tremor underneath the words that he couldn't quite control. Sir, stop, right there. This is a restricted area. The giant didn't stop. The giant didn't even slow down. He looked at Danny the way a man might look at a speed bump in a parking lot. An obstacle to be noted and then immediately dismissed. His black eyes swept over the security guard's substantial frame and found nothing there worth respecting, nothing that registered as a threat to whatever mission was driving him forward. Danny fired the taser. It was a perfect shot, the kind of shot they used in training videos to demonstrate proper technique. The two barbed prongs flew through the air and embedded themselves squarely in the center of the giant's chest, the wires trailing behind them like the strings of some obscene marionette. 50,000 volts of electricity crackled through those wires, enough to drop any normal human being, enough to override voluntary muscle control and turn a charging attacker into a convulsing heap on the floor. The giant looked down at the wires in his chest. He didn't convulse. He didn't fall. He didn't even seem particularly inconvenienced. He simply reached up with one massive hand, grabbed the wires and the barbs attached to them, and ripped them out of his own flesh in a single smooth motion. Blood welled up from the wounds, trickling down his chest in thin red streams, and he didn't appear to notice. "Oh, Jesus," Danny whispered, and for the first time in his adult life, he understood what it meant to be completely outmatched. The giant grabbed Danny by the front of his tactical vest, the fabric bunching in that enormous fist like tissue paper. For a moment, they were face to face, the security guard's feet dangling several inches off the floor, and Danny could see something in those black eyes that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. Not anger, not hatred, but desperation. The desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Then the giant threw him. Danny Sullivan weighed 280 pounds, the majority of which was muscle built over years of dedicated weight training. The giant threw him across the waiting room like he was made of straw, a casual flick of the wrist that sent the security guard sailing through the air in a trajectory that would have been comical if it wasn't so terrifying. Danny crashed into a row of metal chairs, the impact folding the furniture around his body like origami. And then he hit the wall behind them with a sound that made several people scream. He didn't get up. Blood was pooling under his head from a wound that would later require 17 stitches to close, and his breathing had gone shallow and irregular. But he was alive. He would survive. The giant had held back. Some part of him had held back even in the depths of his madness. The emergency room had descended into chaos. Patients were screaming, scrambling over each other in their desperation to reach the exits. Nurses were abandoning their stations, pressing themselves against walls, looking for any kind of cover that might protect them from the monster that had invaded their world. Dr. Cole had frozen in place, his surgical confidence evaporating in the face of a threat that couldn't be solved with a scalpel and a steady hand. Only one person in that room moved forward instead of back. Only one person pushed against the tide of fleeing bodies, positioning herself with the calm deliberation of someone who had done this before, who had faced worse than this and survived. Lily Harper didn't look like a hero. She looked like a victim waiting to happen. A small blonde woman in oversized scrubs who had no business being anywhere near the violence that was unfolding. But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes had gone cold and calculating, processing information at a speed that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't know what she really was. She was counting footsteps, measuring distances, identifying potential weapons in the environment around her. She was doing the math that her training had burned into her brain, the math that told her exactly how long it would take the giant to reach the trauma bay, exactly how many people would get hurt if no one stopped him, exactly what she would have to do and what it would cost her. The clock on the wall read 10:48 p.m. The giant moved through the emergency room like a force of nature, and nature, as everyone in that building was learning, did not concern itself with the fragility of the things in its path. He wasn't attacking randomly, wasn't lashing out at everything around him in mindless fury. There was a terrible purpose to his destruction, a method to the madness that made it somehow worse than pure chaos would have been. He was searching. His black eyes swept the room with each step forward, scanning faces, reading signs, processing the layout of the emergency room with that military precision that even his shattered mind couldn't completely override. "Where is she?" He screamed the words tearing from his throat in a voice that barely sounded human. Grace. A male nurse whose name Lily didn't know made the mistake of trying to be brave. He stepped into the giant's path with his hands raised, saying something about calming down, about talking through whatever was wrong, about there being help available if he would just stop and listen. The giant didn't stop. He didn't listen. He backhanded the nurse with a casual swipe that sent the man spinning into a supply cart, scattering medical supplies across the floor in a cascade of plastic and metal. Another security guard appeared from somewhere, a younger man, who must have been called from another part of the hospital, and he was carrying a canister of pepper spray that he deployed directly into the giant's face. The orange cloud enveloped those terrible features for a moment, and the giant breathed it in like it was nothing more than morning mist. He didn't cough. He didn't flinch. He wiped his eyes with the back of one massive hand and kept moving. The path of destruction was leading somewhere specific. Lily could see it now, could trace the vector of the giant's movement through the emergency room and predict exactly where he was going to end up. Trauma Bay 2. The room where Grace Brennan was fighting for her life, where Dr. Cole had been working to stabilize her before the world exploded into chaos. The giant was following something that no one else could perceive. Some combination of instinct and memory and desperate hope that told him exactly where his sister was located. The problem was clear to anyone who understood the situation, which at this point was probably only Lily. If the giant reached that trauma bay in his current state, he would destroy everything in his path, trying to get to his sister. He would rip out IV lines and overturn equipment and interfere with the treatment that was keeping Grace alive. He would kill her trying to save her, and he would never even understand what he had done. Grace. The scream echoed through the emergency room, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling, and the hard floor filling the space with a sound that was equal parts rage and grief and love, corrupted into something monstrous. "I'm coming. Grace. I'm coming." Lily watched the giant flip a gurney out of his path, watched 200 pounds of steel and wheels crash into a wall with enough force to crack the drywall. She watched him punch through a door that someone had tried to lock against him, his fist going through the wood like it was cardboard. And she made a decision that part of her had known was coming from the moment she felt that first vibration through the floor. She couldn't outfight him. She couldn't outrun him. She couldn't call for help because the help that existed in this building was either unconscious or frozen with fear. The police were minutes away, and minutes might as well be hours when you were counting the seconds until someone died. But she could redirect him. She could draw his attention away from the trauma bay, away from the vulnerable patients and the frozen staff, away from his sister and toward herself. She could buy time with the only currency she had available. Her hand found the challenge coin in her pocket one last time, her thumb tracing the worn insignia as she whispered a prayer to whoever might be listening. Then, she stepped out of the shadows and into the giant's path. Lily Harper had spent 5 years making herself invisible, perfecting the art of being overlooked and underestimated and forgotten. In 3 seconds, she undid all of that work. Dominic. Her voice cut through the chaos of the emergency room like a blade carrying a command authority that seemed impossible coming from such a small frame. The giant froze in mid-step, his black eyes snapping toward the source of the sound, his entire body going rigid with sudden attention. No one in this building knew his name. No one should have known his name. The shock of hearing it stopped him more effectively than the taser or the pepper spray or any of the physical interventions that had failed. Lily stood in the center of the hallway directly between the giant and the door to Trauma Bay 2. She looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile, impossibly outmatched. Her blonde hair had come loose from its ponytail and was hanging around her face in disheveled strands. Her scrubs were wrinkled and stained with someone else's blood. Her hands were empty, weaponless, extended slightly at her sides, in a gesture that could have been surrender or could have been preparation. "I know why you're here," she said, and her voice was calm in a way that made several of the watching staff members question whether she had completely lost her mind. "You're looking for Grace. She's your sister. She's in that room behind me, and the doctors are trying to save her life." The giant's massive hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. His chest was heaving with each breath, the torn fabric of his hoodie rising and falling like the bellows of some enormous forge. Behind the black emptiness of his dilated pupils, something flickered. Recognition, comprehension, a fragment of the man he used to be fighting to surface through the chemical storm that had consumed his mind. "Grace," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "They took her. They always take her. I have to get her out. I have to protect her." "She's not being held prisoner," Lily said, taking a single step forward. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to maintain distance, to keep barriers between herself and the threat. But she could see the humanity struggling to break through, and she knew that distance wasn't what this moment required. She overdosed Dominic. She's very sick. But the people in that room are trying to help her. If you go in there right now, if you interrupt what they're doing, you could kill her. You could kill your sister trying to save her. The words landed like physical blows. The giant swayed on his feet, his face contorting through a rapid series of expressions that revealed the war being fought behind those terrible eyes. Confusion, grief, rage, love, fear. All of it twisting together into something that was almost too painful to watch. "She's dying," he whispered, and suddenly he didn't sound like a monster anymore. He sounded like a broken man standing at the edge of an abyss, staring down into the darkness and seeing nothing but loss. "She's always dying. I can't save her. I couldn't save Mom. I couldn't save Dad. I can't save anyone." For a moment, just a moment, Lily thought it was going to work. She thought she had reached him, had found the thread of humanity that could pull him back from the edge. She took another step forward, her hand extended toward him in a gesture that was almost tender, almost compassionate. And then someone behind her moved. It was one of the residents, a young doctor who had been frozen against the wall and had apparently decided that now was the moment to be brave. He was reaching for his phone, probably to call for additional security, probably to do something that made sense in the world of normal emergencies and standard protocols. But the giant's eyes caught the movement, and whatever fragile connection Lily had been building shattered instantly. "No cops." The scream was even louder than before, raw with betrayal and fresh rage. They'll take her again. They always take her. He lunged forward, and Lily had exactly enough time to realize that she had miscalculated before his massive hand closed around her throat. Her feet left the ground. The world tilted as he lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. His fingers digging into the soft tissue of her neck with enough pressure to cut off her airway completely. She could feel her trachea compressing, could feel the blood flow to her brain, beginning to falter, could feel the edges of her vision starting to go dark. Everyone watching thought they were about to witness a murder. They thought the tiny nurse had made a fatal mistake, had overestimated her ability to reach a monster who was beyond reaching. They were wrong. Because Lily Harper wasn't fighting his grip. She wasn't clawing at his hands or kicking her feet, or doing any of the things that a normal person would do when they were being strangled to death. Her body had gone almost limp, conserving oxygen, minimizing energy expenditure, waiting for the precise moment when his attention wavered. And when that moment came, she moved. The clock on the wall read 10:51 p.m. The pressure around Lily's throat was absolute, a crushing force that seemed designed to demonstrate just how fragile the human body really was when confronted with something that operated outside normal parameters. Dominic Brennan's hand was so large that his fingers nearly overlapped around her neck, and the strength behind that grip could have snapped her spine with minimal additional effort. Her feet dangled 5 inches off the ground, her body suspended in the air like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Everyone in the emergency room who was conscious and watching had already written the ending to this story in their minds. They saw a tiny woman being strangled by a giant, and they assumed they knew what happened next. Some of them were already looking away, unable to watch the violence they believed was inevitable. Others were frozen in that peculiar paralysis that overcomes people when they witness something too terrible to process their brains, refusing to accept the input their eyes were providing. None of them saw what Lily was doing. None of them noticed that her body had stopped struggling, had gone almost completely limp in a way that seemed like surrender, but was actually something far more calculated. None of them observed the subtle shift in her eyes, the way the fear drained out of them like water through a sieve, replaced by something cold and analytical and utterly without mercy. She was counting heartbeats, counting the seconds of oxygen remaining in her bloodstream, counting the micro-movements of the giant's fingers, and the rhythm of his breathing, and the tiny fluctuations in his grip that told her everything she needed to know about his physical state. Her body was dying, technically speaking, but her mind was operating with a clarity that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand what years of combat training could do to the human nervous system. When the moment came, it came without warning. Her right thumb drove into the soft tissue at the corner of Dominic's eye socket, not hard enough to blind him permanently, but hard enough to trigger an involuntary flinch response that even his chemically enhanced state couldn't override. At the same instant, her left hand found the pressure point behind his ear, a cluster of nerves that connected to the vestibular system and could disrupt balance even in someone who felt no pain. Her knee came up with surgical precision, driving into the bundle of nerves at his inner thigh that would cause the leg muscles to momentarily spasm, regardless of conscious control. The moves were ugly. They were brutal. They were the kind of techniques that didn't appear in any self-defense class designed for civilians, because they were designed to cause maximum damage to human anatomy in minimum time. These were the tools of a trade that most people didn't know existed. Skills developed in classified facilities and tested in environments where the only measure of success was whether you walked away alive. Dominic's grip loosened. Not much. Not for long, but enough. Lily dropped from his grasp, hit the floor in a controlled roll that absorbed the impact across her shoulder and back, and came up on her feet 3 yards away before anyone watching had processed what they were seeing. Her throat was already beginning to bruise the imprints of his fingers visible on her pale skin, and her voice when she spoke again was ragged with damage. But she was alive. She was standing. And she was looking at the giant with an expression that bore no resemblance to the timid, mousy nurse who had been working the night shift for the past 3 weeks. The transformation was so complete that several people in the emergency room would later swear they were looking at a different person entirely. The hunched shoulders were gone, replaced by a posture that was perfectly balanced and coiled with potential energy. The downcast eyes were gone, replaced by a gaze that swept the room with tactical awareness and found nothing that registered as a threat except the massive man in front of her. The whisper-soft voice was gone, replaced by something that carried command authority despite the damage to her vocal cords. Who the hell are you? Patricia Morrison's voice cut through the stunned silence, the charge nurse staring at Lily with an expression that mixed shock with something that looked almost like recognition. What the hell was that? Lily didn't answer. She didn't have time to answer because the giant was already recovering from her strikes, already shaking off the disorientation and turning back toward her with renewed fury in those terrible black eyes. But for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, she met Patty's gaze and allowed the older woman to see the truth. She wasn't Lily Harper. She had never been Lily Harper, not really. Lily Harper was a costume of disguise, a carefully constructed fiction designed to let a ghost walk among the living without being recognized. The woman standing in the emergency room now, the woman with the bruised throat and the cold eyes and the combat stance that belonged on a battlefield rather than a hospital floor, was someone else entirely. Someone who had spent 5 years trying to disappear. Someone who had just realized that disappearing was no longer an option. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and for a moment Lily was somewhere else entirely. The emergency room faded away, replaced by memories she had spent 5 years trying to bury, images that rose up from the depths of her mind with the unstoppable force of something that had been suppressed too long. She remembered a different woman standing in a different room. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 68W combat medic attached to a Joint Special Operations Unit, whose official designation was still classified, and whose unofficial nickname was whispered only among those who had earned the right to know it. Her blonde hair had been shorter, then pulled back in a tight regulation bun that kept it out of her face during operations. Her body had been harder honed by years of training that pushed human limits and then demanded more. She remembered the mission that broke her. A compound in a country she wasn't supposed to be in, extracting a high-value asset whose identity she was never told. The intelligence had been wrong, or the intelligence had been compromised, or the intelligence had been a trap from the beginning. It didn't matter which, because the result was the same. Gunfire from positions that weren't supposed to exist. 3 members of her team dead in the first 30 seconds. The asset screaming as bullets punched through walls that were supposed to provide cover. She remembered dragging the only survivor half a mile through hostile territory, his blood soaking through her uniform as she applied pressure to wounds that should have killed him 3 times over. She remembered the weight of him on her shoulders, the burning in her muscles, the absolute certainty that every step forward was a step closer to death. She remembered the moment when the extraction helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, and the moment immediately after when the ground erupted beneath her feet and the world turned into fire and noise and pain. But she also remembered something else. Something from before the mission, before the trauma, before the woman called Elena Vasquez became a casualty of a war that would never appear in any history book. She remembered a gala event at a facility whose location she had sworn never to reveal. Crystal chandeliers casting fragments of light across a ballroom filled with people who officially did not exist. Music playing from a string quartet in the corner. And Elena, wearing a crimson-red dress that had been fitted perfectly to her frame, the fabric-hugging curves that her tactical gear usually concealed her blonde hair loose around her shoulders for the first time in months. She remembered dancing with the man whose name she had never learned, whose face she could no longer recall, whose arms around her waist had felt like the safest place in the world. She remembered laughing, actually laughing, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her that the war hadn't touched yet. She remembered looking at her reflection in the ballroom windows and seeing someone beautiful, someone powerful, someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. That woman could walk into any room and command it without saying a word. That woman could charm ambassadors and intimidate generals and save lives in conditions that would have broken anyone without her training. That woman had a closet full of elegant dresses and a footlocker full of weapons, and she was equally comfortable with both. That woman had died in the desert, or at least Elena had told herself she died. The discharge had been honorable, the official paperwork citing injuries sustained in the line of duty and recommending a medical separation with full benefits. The unofficial reality was simpler and more brutal. Elena Vasquez had looked at herself in the mirror one morning and realized she no longer recognized the person staring back at her. The woman in the reflection had eyes that had seen too much, hands that had done too much, a soul that had been scraped raw by experiences that no amount of therapy could adequately address. So she had made herself disappear. New name, new identity, new life constructed piece by piece from the fragments of someone who wanted nothing more than to be ordinary. Lily Harper was born in a courthouse in a city far from anywhere Elena had ever operated a legal fiction that gradually became something more real. The red dress went into a box at the back of a storage unit. The tactical skills went into a mental vault that Lily tried never to open. The challenge coin stayed in her pocket because some things were too much a part of you to ever completely let go. She had told herself she was healing. She had told herself the quiet life was what she needed, that saving lives in an emergency room was penance for the lives she had taken in places that didn't exist on any map. She had told herself that Lily Harper could be enough, that the ghost of Elena Vasquez would eventually fade into nothing more than a distant memory. She had been wrong. The memory shattered, and Lily was back in the emergency room, back in the present, back in a body that was bruised and battered and suddenly terrifyingly alive, in a way it hadn't been in 5 years. The giant was still in front of her. Still dangerous, still a threat to everyone in the building. But something had shifted in the way she was looking at him. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't pretending to be weak, wasn't hunching her shoulders or keeping her eyes down or doing any of the 1,000 small things she had trained herself to do in order to maintain her disguise. She was standing the way Elena Vasquez used to stand, balanced and ready, every muscle in her body prepared for violence. The challenge coin in her pocket felt different now. Not like a reminder of who she used to be, but like a key that had finally found its lock. You can't save them by hiding, she told herself. You can only save them by being who you really are. Dominic Brennan stared at the small woman who had just escaped his grip, and somewhere behind the chemical madness that had consumed his mind, a fragment of tactical awareness struggled to make sense of what had just happened. He was trained. He had served 3 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment before the IED that ended his career and scrambled something fundamental in his brain. He knew what combat looked like, knew the difference between a civilian and an operator, knew that the woman standing in front of him moved with a precision that didn't belong in a hospital. "You're not a nurse," he said, the words coming out rough and confused. The rage was still there, burning beneath the surface, but it had been joined by something else now. Recognition. The acknowledgement that he was facing someone who understood the language of violence as well as he did. "Neither are you," Lily replied. Her voice was still damaged from his grip, but there was steel underneath the rasp. 68W Combat Medic. And you? 75th Rangers, if I had to guess. 3rd Battalion, based on the vintage of those dog tags. The giant's hand moved involuntarily to the tags hanging beneath his torn hoodie, a reflexive gesture that spoke to years of wearing them close to his heart. "How did you—" "Because I've served with Rangers before. I know the way you move, the way you clear corners even when you're out of your mind. You're not a monster, Dominic. You're a soldier who lost his mission." The words hit him like physical blows, each one cracking through the armor of rage and psychosis that had been protecting him from the unbearable weight of his own emotions. His massive frame shuddered, his black eyes blinking rapidly as conflicting impulses warred for control of his nervous system. "Grace is all I have," he whispered, and suddenly the giant didn't sound like a threat anymore. He sounded like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss that had been calling his name for a very long time. "Mom and Dad died in a car accident when I was 19. I raised her. I took care of her. I was supposed to protect her. Lily didn't move, didn't break eye contact, didn't do anything that might shatter the fragile moment of connection that was forming between them. What happened? She started using after I got back from my 3rd tour. She couldn't handle watching me fall apart, and I couldn't handle watching her watch me fall apart, and we just kept destroying each other." His voice cracked on the words. "I tried everything. Rehab, interventions, threats, begging. Nothing worked. Nothing ever works. How did you end up here, Dominic? Walk me through it." The question seemed to anchor him somehow, gave his fractured mind something to focus on besides the overwhelming need to find his sister and the overwhelming fear that he was already too late. "She checked herself out of a facility this morning. Against medical advice. I got a call 6 hours ago from her neighbor. She was unresponsive in her apartment. I rode in the ambulance with her. I watched them take her away. And then they made me wait. At the other hospital. They said I couldn't see her because of privacy laws, because I was agitated, because they had to follow protocol." The rage was building again, seeping back through the cracks in his composure. "I just wanted to be with her. I just wanted to hold her hand. And they treated me like a criminal." Lily understood then. She understood what had happened at the other hospital, how the combination of traumatic brain injury, extreme emotional stress, And whatever sedatives the security staff had administered had triggered the cascade that transformed a desperate brother into something that looked like a monster. The excited delirium wasn't a character flaw. It was a medical emergency, a failure of brain chemistry that he had no more control over than a diabetic had control over their blood sugar. He wasn't evil. He was broken, just like she was broken. Two soldiers who had given everything they had to wars that most people would never know about, and who had come home to discover that the hardest battles were the ones that happened inside your own head. "I see you," Lily said quietly. "I see who you really are underneath all of this. You're not here to hurt anyone. You're here because the person you love most in the world is dying, and no one will let you be there for her." Dominic's eyes were wet now, tears cutting tracks through the grime and sweat on his face. "I can't lose her. I can't. She's the only reason I didn't eat a bullet when I got back from overseas. She's the only reason I'm still alive. She's still alive too. She's in that room behind me, and the doctors are doing everything they can to save her. But I need you to hear me, Dominic. If you go in there right now, in the state you're in, you will interfere with her treatment. You will hurt the people trying to help her. You might kill her without meaning to. Is that what you want? Is that how you want to protect her?" The giant swayed on his feet, his massive frame trembling with the effort of holding himself together. For a long moment, Lily thought she had reached him, thought she had found the thread of humanity that could pull him back from the edge. But then his eyes went black again. The chemical storm in his brain surged back to dominance, overwhelming whatever rationality had briefly surfaced. His hands clenched into fists, and the desperate brother disappeared, replaced once more by the monster that fear and drugs and trauma had created. "I have to save her," he said, and his voice was no longer human. "I have to save her. I have to save her. I have to—" He lunged. The first strike was aimed at Lily's head, a haymaker punch that would have shattered her skull if it had connected. She wasn't there when it arrived. She had read the attack in the coiling of his shoulders a fraction of a second before it launched, and by the time his fist cut through the air, she was already moving, ducking under his arm, and spinning away to create distance. This was not going to be a fight she could win through conventional means, and Lily knew it with absolute certainty. Dominic Brennan outweighed her by more than 200 pounds, stood nearly 1.5 feet taller than her, and was operating with the kind of chemically enhanced strength that allowed people to perform feats that should have been physically impossible. She had seen soldiers in excited delirium lift cars, break through doors that should have stopped them, take injuries that would have incapacitated normal human beings, and keep coming like they hadn't felt a thing. She couldn't match his strength. She couldn't outlast his endurance. She couldn't rely on pain compliance techniques because he currently wasn't capable of feeling pain in any meaningful way. What she could do was be faster than him, be smarter than him, and make him chase her through an environment that offered countless opportunities for creative improvisation. Lily ran, not away from the fight, but into it, drawing the giant deeper into the emergency room and away from the trauma bay where his sister lay dying. She crashed through a door marked radiology and slapped at the light switches as she passed, plunging the corridor beyond into darkness. Her sneakers made no sound on the tile floor, a lifetime of training expressing itself in muscle memory that operated below the level of conscious thought. Behind her, she could hear him coming. The thunder of his footsteps, the crash of obstacles being demolished in his path, the heavy rhythm of his breathing that sounded like a forge bellows, working overtime. He was fast for a man his size, terrifyingly fast, but he was also loud and predictable, and following her into terrain that favored her advantages over his. The radiology wing was a maze of corridors and examination rooms filled with expensive equipment and narrow passages that a 7-foot giant would have difficulty navigating at speed. Lily used the darkness like a weapon, moving through spaces that she had memorized during her 3 weeks at St. Jude's, emerging from shadows to strike and then vanishing before he could respond. A palm strike to his kidney delivered from behind as he passed a doorway without checking it. She was gone before he finished turning around the impact, leaving a deep bruise that would have doubled over a normal man but barely slowed him down. A kick to the back of his knee timed for the moment when his weight was committed to a forward step. He stumbled, but didn't fall, his hand smashing into the wall where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Each attack cost her something. Energy she couldn't afford to waste, positions she couldn't afford to compromise, time that ticked away with every heartbeat. She could feel her body beginning to fail, the accumulated damage from his earlier grip on her throat, combining with the strain of constant movement to erode her reserves. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges, her lungs burning with each breath, her muscles screaming for rest that she couldn't give them. But she kept moving. She kept fighting, because somewhere behind her, there was a room full of patients who couldn't defend themselves. And somewhere in front of her, there was a broken man who needed to be stopped before he destroyed everything he loved. The cat and mouse game continued through the darkened corridors, a deadly dance between a titan and a ghost. The mistake was inevitable, given enough time. Lily had been navigating the radiology wing from memory, but memory was imperfect, and the darkness was absolute, and eventually she turned down a corridor that ended in a wall instead of another exit. By the time she realized her error, Dominic was already blocking the way back, his massive silhouette filling the hallway like a wall of muscle and rage. They faced each other in the flickering glow of an emergency exit sign, the only light source in the corridor casting everything in shades of red and black. She could see his chest heaving with each breath, could see the sweat and blood that covered his skin, could see the terrible emptiness in his eyes that told her the man she had briefly reached was gone again, buried under the chemical tide that had consumed his mind. "You can't run anymore," he said, and his voice echoed off the walls in a way that made it sound like there were multiple versions of him speaking at once. "You can't hide. Just get out of my way. Let me get to my sister. I don't want to hurt you." "You're already hurting yourself," Lily replied. Her voice was steady, despite the fear that was clawing at the edges of her composure. "Every minute you spend chasing me is a minute you're not spending by her side. Every second your heart rate stays this elevated is a second closer to cardiac arrest. Your body can't sustain this, Dominic. The drugs, the adrenaline, the stress, you're killing yourself. I don't care. I know you don't. That's what scares me." She took a breath, buying time, her eyes scanning the corridor for anything she could use. "I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. I know what it feels like to love someone so much that you're willing to burn down the whole world to save them. I know what it feels like when that love turns into something you can't control." The giant's fists unclenched slightly. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're a ranger. I know you served your country in places that most people can't even imagine. I know you came home with a traumatic brain injury that probably went untreated because the VA system is broken, and you didn't want to seem weak." She was guessing now, but his face told her she was guessing correctly. "I know your sister was the only thing keeping you tethered to this world, and when she started slipping away, you started slipping too. Stop talking." The words were almost a plea. "Stop pretending you understand. Then help me understand." She took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them despite every survival instinct screaming at her to do the opposite. "Tell me about Grace. Tell me who she is, not what she's become. Tell me why you love her enough to tear through a hospital full of innocent people." For a long moment, nothing happened. The giant stood frozen in the red glow of the exit sign, his massive frame trembling with emotions that he had been suppressing since long before tonight. And then slowly, like a glacier beginning to crack, something broke open behind his eyes. "She used to draw," he whispered, "when we were kids. She would spend hours with her crayons making pictures of everything she saw. Birds and trees and our house and me standing in front of it like some kind of superhero. She was always drawing me as a superhero. What happened to those drawings? I kept them. Every single one. They're in a box under my bed. Sometimes when everything gets too dark, I take them out and look at them and try to remember what it felt like to be someone's hero." Lily was close enough now to touch him if she reached out. Close enough to see the tears streaming down his face. Close enough to see the man buried under the monster fighting to break free. "You're still her hero, Dominic. You're here because you love her. That love got twisted by the drugs and the trauma and the desperation. But it's still love. It's still real. And right now, the most heroic thing you can do for Grace is let the doctors save her life." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and for a moment, she saw recognition in his eyes. Recognition not just of who she was, but of what she was offering. A way out. A path back from the edge. Then a door opened behind him, and everything fell apart. Dr. Nathan Cole had finally found his courage at the worst possible moment. The attending physician appeared in the doorway at the far end of the corridor, silhouetted against the fluorescent lights of the main emergency room behind him. He was holding a fire extinguisher like a baseball bat. His handsome face set in an expression of determination that would have been admirable if it hadn't been so catastrophically timed. "Get away from her!" Cole shouted, charging forward with the fire extinguisher raised above his head. "I've called the police. They're on their way. Just let her go." Dominic's head snapped toward the sound, the fragile connection that Lily had been building, shattering instantly. The mention of police triggered something deep in his traumatized psyche, some association with authority figures and separation, and all the systems that had failed him and his sister over the years. His eyes went black again, and the man who had been crying about crayon drawings disappeared, replaced by the monster who had torn through the emergency room doors. "No police," he said, his voice dropping into something barely human. "No more police. They always take her. They always take everyone." Cole swung the fire extinguisher at Dominic's head, putting everything he had into the blow. The giant caught it in mid-swing, his massive hand closing around the red metal cylinder like it was a toy. For a moment, they stood frozen, the surgeon straining with all his strength to complete an attack that had already failed. Then Dominic headbutted him. The impact was audible throughout the corridor, a wet crunch that spoke of broken cartilage and shattered hopes. Cole's nose exploded in a spray of blood, his eyes rolling back in his head as consciousness left him before he even started falling. He hit the floor in a boneless heap, the fire extinguisher clattering away into the darkness. "No!" Lily lunged forward, trying to position herself between the giant and the fallen surgeon, but she was too slow, too damaged, too late. Dominic kicked Cole's unconscious body aside and kept moving, heading back toward the emergency room, back toward the trauma bay, where Grace was fighting for her life. Nothing Lily had said mattered anymore. Nothing she could do with her bare hands would be enough to stop him. But then the cavalry arrived and everything got worse. Officer Kevin Walsh came through the emergency room doors with his weapon drawn, responding to a call about a violent disturbance that had been dispatched while Lily and Dominic were playing cat and mouse in the radiology wing. He was 31 years old, a 10-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department, and he had never seen anything like the scene that greeted him. The emergency room looked like a war zone. Broken glass everywhere, overturned equipment, blood smeared across the floor in patterns that suggested someone had been dragged or thrown. A security guard was being attended to by nurses in one corner, his head wound still bleeding through the bandages. Medical staff were huddled against walls, their faces white with fear. And in the center of it all, moving toward him with unstoppable purpose, was the largest human being Officer Walsh had ever seen. Police freeze. Walsh leveled his service weapon at the giant, his training taking over despite the terror that was clawing at his professional composure. "Get on the ground now." "Hands where I can see them." Dominic didn't freeze. Dominic didn't get on the ground. Dominic looked at the gun being pointed at his chest and saw nothing but another obstacle between him and his sister. Walsh fired once. The bullet caught Dominic in the left shoulder, spinning him slightly with the impact, blood spraying from the wound in a pattern that painted the wall behind him. A shot like that should have dropped any normal person. It should have at least stopped their forward momentum, made them reconsider their choices, given some indication that the laws of physics still applied. Dominic kept coming. Walsh fired again, but his hands were shaking now, the reality of the situation overwhelming his training. The second shot went wide, punching a hole in the wall 6 inches from the giant's head. Before he could fire a third time, Dominic was on him. The officer went through the window of the ambulance bay with enough force to shatter the reinforced glass, his body tumbling across the wet pavement outside before coming to rest against the wheel of a parked ambulance. His body cam still recording captured the rain falling on his unconscious face and the giant turning back toward the interior of the hospital. Lily watched all of this from the mouth of the radiology corridor, her mind racing through options that were rapidly narrowing to a single terrible point. Tasers didn't work. Bullets didn't work. Pepper spray fire extinguishers, physical intervention. Nothing that operated according to normal rules had any effect on a man whose body had been hijacked by chemistry and trauma. She needed something else. Something that could bypass muscle and bone and rage. Something that could reach directly into the electrical impulses that controlled his heart and his nervous system. Her eyes fell on the crash cart in the corner of the treatment area, its red surface visible through the chaos like a beacon. The defibrillator. 360 joules of electrical current designed to restart a heart that had stopped beating, or to stop one that was beating too fast. Lily moved through the wreckage of the emergency room with a purpose that bordered on possession, her damaged body operating on reserves that she hadn't known she still possessed. The crash cart was 15 feet away, then 10, then 5, her hands reaching for the defibrillator paddles before she had fully formulated the plan that her instincts had already committed to. Dominic. She screamed his name with every ounce of volume her damaged throat could produce, forcing the sound out through tissue that felt like it had been scraped raw. Your sister is stable. I saw the monitors before everything went crazy. Her vitals are improving. She's going to live. The giant stopped. Turned. Those terrible black eyes found her across the destroyed treatment area, and for a moment, there was something behind them that might have been hope. You're lying, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Everyone lies. Everyone always lies. Why would I lie? Lily was working as she spoke, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this exact procedure dozens of times before. Paddles out. Power on. Charge setting to maximum. I'm not your enemy, Dominic. I'm not the system that failed you. I'm just a nurse who wants to save lives, including yours. The defibrillator whined as it charged the sound building toward the high-pitched tone that indicated full capacity. 360 joules. Enough to restart a stopped heart. Enough to override the electrical signals controlling his muscles. Enough to end this one way or another. Grace Brennan, room 304. I saw her chart. I saw her vitals. The Narcan is working. Her blood oxygen is improving. She's fighting Dominic. She's fighting to come back to you. But she can't do that if you're dead or in prison. She can't do that if the brother she loves destroys himself trying to save her. Dominic swayed on his feet, the words hitting him like physical blows. The bullet wound in his shoulder was bleeding freely now, dark red spreading across the gray fabric of his hoodie, and his face had gone pale beneath the flush of his chemically elevated blood pressure. He was dying. Even without the defibrillator, his body was tearing itself apart from the inside. I just want to see her, he whispered, and suddenly he sounded like a child. A lost, broken child who had run out of strength and didn't know how to stop fighting. I just want to hold her hand. Please, please let me see her. I know. Lily stepped closer, the charged paddles humming in her hands. I know you do, and I swear to you on everything I've ever believed in that I will make sure you get to see her. But first you have to stop. First you have to let the doctors do their job. First you have to trust me. For one eternal moment she thought it was going to work. She thought the words had finally penetrated the chemical fog, had finally reached the man buried under the monster. Dominic's eyes flickered. His fists unclenched. His massive frame seemed to sag as the fight drained out of him. Then his knees buckled, and he started to fall, and Lily realized with horror that he was collapsing toward her. 315 pounds of unconscious weight, about to crush her against the floor. She didn't think. She acted. The paddles came up pressed against his chest as he fell. Her thumb found the discharge button without conscious direction. Her mouth formed the word that every medical professional says before delivering a shock. Even though there was no one to clear, even though she was the only person close enough to feel the current. Clear. 360 joules surged through Dominic Brennan's body at the exact moment his weight drove Lily backward into the crash cart. The electricity found the path of least resistance through his cardiovascular system, overriding the chaotic signals that had been driving his heart to beat faster and faster and faster. His muscles contracted all at once, a full-body spasm that lifted him slightly off the ground even as gravity was pulling him down. The sound was not the sharp crack of movie defibrillators. It was a deep, resonant thump that Lily felt in her own chest like the heartbeat of something impossibly large. Dominic's eyes flew open, the black depths of his dilated pupils suddenly flooding with white as his irises spasmed. His mouth opened in a silent scream. Smoke curling from the points where the paddles had contacted his skin. Then he fell. 315 pounds of unconscious giant crashed to the floor beside her, his head bouncing once off the linoleum before coming to rest in a spreading pool of the water that the sprinkler system had deposited everywhere. His chest rose, fell, rose again. The chemical tide that had been driving him toward destruction had been broken, the electrical reset of the defibrillator forcing his cardiac rhythm back into something approaching normal. He was alive. The monster was gone, and only the broken man remained. Lily let the paddles drop from her hands. She tried to stand, found that her legs had apparently decided to stop working, and settled for sliding down the side of the crash cart until she was sitting on the wet floor next to the man she had just saved and stopped. Mission complete, she whispered to no one in particular. And then the world went dark. The SWAT team breached the emergency room doors 4 minutes and 37 seconds after Lily Harper lost consciousness, a flood of black armored operators flowing into a space that had already fallen silent. They came expecting a war zone, expecting active resistance, expecting the kind of chaos that required flashbang grenades and coordinated room-clearing techniques. What they found was something else entirely. The giant lay on his back in the center of the treatment area, smoke still rising from the electrical burns on his chest, his breathing shallow but steady. A police officer was being pulled through the shattered window by paramedics, his body cam still recording footage that would be viewed millions of times in the coming days. A surgeon lay unconscious near the radiology corridor, his face a mask of blood already being attended to by nurses who had emerged from hiding once the danger had passed. And sitting against a crash cart, her blonde hair matted with sweat and blood, her neck ringed with purple bruises in the shape of a giant's fingers, was the smallest person in the room. The SWAT team leader approached her with his weapon lowered, his training telling him that this woman was not a threat, even as his instincts told him that something about her didn't add up. "Ma'am, are you okay? Can you hear me?" Lily's eyes opened slowly, taking a moment to focus on the armored figure crouching in front of her. She looked at him, then at the unconscious giant, then at the destroyed emergency room around her. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, scraped raw by damage that would take weeks to fully heal. "I'm going on break," she said. Then she passed out again. Lily woke in a hospital bed with Patricia Morrison sitting in the visitor's chair, the charged nurse's face wearing an expression that mixed exhaustion with something that looked uncomfortably like respect. The morning light was streaming through the window, which meant she had been unconscious for at least 6 hours, and every part of her body hurt in ways that reminded her of mornings after combat operations in places she was no longer supposed to remember. Grace Brennan made a full recovery, Patty said, answering the question that Lily hadn't asked yet. She regained consciousness about 2 hours ago. First thing she asked for was her brother, and Dominic's psychiatric hold at Harborview. The defibrillator shock broke the excited delirium, and the doctors say there's no permanent cardiac damage. He'll face charges for what he did, but his lawyer is already arguing diminished capacity. Patty paused, her hard eyes softening slightly. "He asked about you, the nurse who stopped him. He wanted to say thank you." Lily looked at the ceiling, processing information that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. What about Dr. Cole? Broken nose, 2 black eyes, and a severely bruised ego. He's already talking about how brave he was for confronting the attacker. Patty's voice carried a note of dry amusement. "I made sure to mention to the hospital administrator that he charged in and got himself knocked unconscious while you were the one who actually stopped the threat. His promotion to department head has been indefinitely postponed. The security footage everywhere. Officer Walsh's body cam too. You're famous, Lily. Or should I call you something else?" Patty leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the intelligence that had allowed her to survive 25 years in emergency medicine. "I've worked with a lot of nurses. None of them move the way you move. None of them fight the way you fight. So I'm only going to ask this once, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you want. Who are you really?" Lily was quiet for a long moment, her fingers finding the challenge coin that someone had placed on the bedside table, along with her other personal effects. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the worn insignia, remembering the woman who used to wear red dresses and dance at military galas. "I'm Lily Harper," she finally said. "I'm a nurse at St. Jude's Medical Center, and I think I'm finally ready to stop running from who I used to be." 6 weeks later, Lily walked through the repaired emergency room doors with her badge displaying new tech staff instead of traveler. Big Danny Sullivan stood up from the security desk and offered her a salute that she returned with a small smile. The scars were still healing, both the visible ones on her neck and the invisible ones that ran much deeper, but something had changed in the way she carried herself. The hunched shoulders were gone. The downcast eyes were gone. In their place was a woman who had finally made peace with all the versions of herself. A young nurse named Jessica Mills was waiting at the station, fresh out of nursing school, and visibly terrified of her first real shift. She looked at Lily with the wide-eyed wonder of someone who had seen the viral footage and couldn't quite believe she was standing next to the woman in the video. "They call you the Titan Slayer," Jessica said. Is it true? Did you really take down a 7-foot giant with the defibrillator? Lily adjusted her scrubs and considered the question. I didn't slay anything, she said finally. I just did what needed to be done to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. That's the job. It's not about being a hero. It's about being the last line of defense when everything else fails. She handed Jessica a pair of gloves and nodded toward the trauma bay. Come on. Dr. Cole gets cranky if we're slow, and trust me, you don't want to see me when I'm cranky either. As they walked down the corridor, Lily's hand drifted to her pocket to the challenge coin that she still carried everywhere she went. It felt different now. Not like a reminder of who she used to be, but like a promise of who she had finally become. She was Lily Harper. She was Elena Vasquez. She was a nurse and a soldier and a survivor. And somewhere in a rehabilitation facility across the city, a giant named Dominic was learning to live again, while his sister drew pictures of the woman who had saved them both. The rookie was gone forever. The veteran had finally come home, and that, my friends, is the true story of Lily Harper and the night she became the Titan Slayer. It's a reminder that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to look. Sometimes they're small. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they've spent years hiding from themselves, waiting for the moment when they finally have to remember who they really are. Dominic Brennan was a force of nature that night, 315 pounds of rage and grief and love, twisted into something monstrous. But Lily Harper was a force of will. She saved her patients. She saved the police officer. She saved the doctor who had mocked her. And in the end, she even saved the monster himself. This story makes me wonder, how many heroes are walking among us right now, disguised as ordinary people? How many veterans are working quiet jobs, hiding the skills that once saved lives in places we'll never know about? How many people are one moment away from having to choose between staying invisible and stepping into the fire? If this story moved you, if it reminded you that true strength isn't measured in size or muscle, but in the courage to stand your ground when everyone else is running away, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. It takes less than a second, but it tells YouTube that stories like this matter, that stories about real heroism and sacrifice deserve to be heard. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story. I've got more incredible tales coming your way. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with a nurse, a veteran, a first responder, anyone who has ever felt invisible while doing work that matters. Let them know that we see them. Let them know that their quiet strength doesn't go unnoticed. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a moment where you had to become someone you didn't know you could be? A moment where the person everyone underestimated turned out to be the only one who could save the day. I read every single comment, and your stories inspire the next videos on this channel. Until next time, remember, the smallest person in the room might just be the most dangerous one. Stay safe out there, and never ever underestimate the quiet ones.